The point is that I then became anxious, and then I started having panic attacks. I did not feel comfortable. I didn't want to go to Hollywood. I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to be a star, certainly.
She's Hollywood's eternal golden girl. A smile that could light up a room. A laugh that became her signature. But behind that sunshine, Goldie Hawn has a list. A private list. 6 names she'll never forget. Because each one left a mark she refuses to forgive. They're not the people you'd expect. Some are legends, some are icons, and some are the kind of men you'd never want to meet when the cameras stop rolling. By the time you hear the last name, you might never look at them the same way again. To Goldie, he was part of the architecture of Hollywood. One of those towering figures whose career had shaped the industry long before she arrived. She'd grown up watching him in epic roles, hearing stories of his work ethic, and seeing him held up as the gold standard of leading men. She respected that. She respected legacy. Goldie had never been the type to pretend she'd built her career without standing on the shoulders of giants. But over time, she learned something about giants. Some will never see you as an equal builder. To them, you're not a colleague. You're just the pretty addition to the scenery. Her early encounters with Douglas were polite enough. At award shows, he'd greet her like an old friend. Slow, deliberate hand kisses, the kind of exaggerated gallantry people called old school. At parties, he'd lean in with theatrical winks and compliments about her looks. The kind of moments everyone else seemed to find charming. Goldie smiled along, because that's what was expected. But privately, she admitted it gnawed at her. "He talks to me like I'm still the blonde in a bikini scene," she once told a confidant. "And I've won an Oscar." It wasn't one explosive fight that turned her against him. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The industry panels where she couldn't finish a thought without being interrupted. The roundtables where her ideas about filmmaking were skimmed over, while men in the room received long, glowing introductions. The scripts she helped develop, only to hear them presented as the vision of her male collaborators, while she was praised as the ever-effervescent Goldie Hawn. For years, she let it slide. She'd been in Hollywood long enough to know that confronting every slight would only exhaust her. But there's a difference between letting something go and accepting it forever. And one meeting finally drew the line. It was a closed-door session for a film she was co-producing. Douglas wasn't even scheduled to be there, but he dropped in as a favor to someone in the room. Goldie began presenting her thoughts on the script's emotional core. Mid-sentence, Douglas cut her off with a smirk. "You've always been great at selling emotion." The room laughed. Goldie didn't. She closed her notebook, stood up, and said calmly, "I've said what I need to say." Then she walked out. No big scene, no shouting match, just finality. After that, she made a quiet but deliberate choice. Kirk Douglas's name would never again pass her lips in an interview unless absolutely necessary. When asked about Hollywood legends she'd worked with, she skipped over him entirely. And when friends pressed her, she gave the same answer every time. Some men don't deserve a second act in your memory. To Goldie, Douglas wasn't a monster. He was a mirror, reflecting the deeply rooted idea that a woman's greatest asset in Hollywood was her smile, no matter how sharp her mind or heavy her resume. And she'd had enough of playing along. In the 1970s, Beatty was more than a movie star. He was Hollywood royalty. He had the looks, the charm, the reputation, and the kind of influence that could open doors most actors didn't even know existed. Being on Warren Beatty's radar was considered a career-making moment for an actress. But for Goldie, it was the start of something far more dangerous. It began innocently enough. A casual lunch invitation, a dinner after an awards show, Beatty knew exactly how to make someone feel like the most important person in the room, leaning in just close enough when he spoke, locking eyes like no one else existed, sprinkling compliments in the right places. People called it effortless charm. Goldie called it rehearsed. She wasn't naive. She'd heard the stories, the endless string of famous women who had been linked to him, the rumors that he collected relationships like trophies, the whispered warnings that saying no to him wasn't always taken well. Goldie appreciated the attention, but she knew the game he was playing, and she wasn't interested in being another chapter in Warren Beatty's unofficial biography. So she declined, politely but consistently. She kept the conversations friendly, smiled at industry events, but every time an invitation crossed her path, she passed. At first, he took it in stride, but Warren Beatty wasn't used to rejection. And when he realized no meant no with Goldie, the charm began to crack. His once warm, playful tone cooled. The friendly banter disappeared. And soon, something quieter and far more insidious began to happen. The invitations to premieres and parties stopped. The directors who'd once called her regularly suddenly became too busy. Scripts she had been in the running for were mysteriously no longer available. It wasn't a public scandal or a screaming match. It was Hollywood Sabotage 101. Quiet suggestion, repeated just enough to the right people, until it started to shape her reputation. The whispers spread like smoke. She's difficult. She's flaky. She's not serious enough for dramatic roles. One producer, years later, admitted to Goldie that he had been told directly she came with baggage. But the only baggage was Warren Beatty's bruised ego. Goldie never publicly accused him of anything. When asked in interviews if she'd ever work with him, she would give a polite but cutting answer. "I don't mix business with power plays." That was all she ever needed to say. In private, though, she was more blunt. Friends recall her describing him as a man who doesn't handle rejection. He punishes it. Not with tantrums or lawsuits, but with surgical precision. A comment here, a warning there, just enough to make people think twice before calling your agent. She could have fought back. She could have fed the gossip mill with her own stories, but she refused to play his game. Instead, she stayed quiet, stayed professional, and built her career without him. Years later, fate, or Hollywood's twisted sense of humor, brought them into the same room again. It was a glittering award show. Cameras everywhere. Beatty spotted her, flashed that famous smile, and started walking over like they were old friends. Goldie met his eyes, smiled back, cool, calm, and colder than ice, then turned on her heel and walked away, without a word. A journalist nearby, watching the exchange, whispered, "That smile could freeze hell." For Goldie, that moment was the final word. No rant, no revenge, just a living, breathing reminder that she'd outlasted him. While his legacy became tangled in rumors, ego, and broken relationships, hers stayed intact, defined not by the men who tried to control her, but by the woman who refused to be controlled. When Foul Play hit theaters in 1978, audiences fell in love with the pairing of Goldie Hawn and Chevy Chase. On screen, their chemistry was effortless, her sunny charm balanced by his sly, quick-witted humor. To fans, it looked like a match made in comedy heaven, but behind the scenes, it was anything but heavenly. At the time, Chevy was riding high off his breakout success on Saturday Night Live. His smug, too cool persona had made him a household name, but on set, That ego was more than just an act. Crew members described him as unpredictable, volatile, charming in one moment, condescending in the next. Director Colin Higgins worked hard to keep the production on track, but Chevy constantly tested boundaries. He'd throw out entire scenes if they didn't amuse him, improvise lines without warning, and reject takes simply because he didn't like them. He acted like the movie was his kingdom, one crew member recalled, and the rest of us were just here to keep him entertained. The tension wasn't limited to the crew. Goldie found herself at the center of it. Despite her status as one of the most bankable stars in Hollywood, Chevy repeatedly undermined her during filming, interrupting her lines, dismissing her comedic instincts, and making snide comments about her image. One stylist remembered overhearing Goldie whisper, "He's not funny when the cameras stop rolling. He's just cruel." The breaking point came when Chevy began refusing to shoot certain scenes unless they were rewritten to give him what he called real punchlines. It wasn't about improving the film. It was about keeping the spotlight firmly on him. By the time production wrapped, Goldie was done. When studios later floated the idea of a sequel or reunion project, she didn't hesitate. Her answer to her agent was just 2 words: not interested. No matter the paycheck, she would never work with Chevy Chase again. But if Chevy's brand of chaos was exhausting, the next man on her list turned unpredictability into a weapon. In the late 1980s, pairing Goldie Hawn with Bill Murray seemed like a guaranteed hit. She was America's sweetheart. He was comedy's wild card, unpredictable, magnetic, and beloved for it. Studios couldn't wait to see the magic they might create together. It all fell apart at the very first table read. Goldie arrived on time, script in hand, ready to work. Murray arrived more than an hour late. No greeting, no apology. Just a sarcastic jab at a junior writer before dropping into his chair and tossing his script onto the table like it was beneath him. From the moment they began reading, Murray hijacked the room. He ignored the script, replacing lines with improvised jokes, rolling his eyes during other actors' dialogue, and openly mocking the emotional beats of the story. Goldie tried to roll with it. She'd come up in improv, after all. But this wasn't collaboration. It was sabotage. The moment that ended, it all came during a particularly emotional scene. Goldie was delivering her lines with quiet sincerity when Murray interrupted her mid-sentence, deadpan, "Why don't you try acting like you've done drama before?" The room froze, then broke into uncomfortable laughter. Goldie didn't flinch. She simply closed her script, stood up, and walked out. No speech, no outburst, just silent finality. The next day, her representatives called the producers. She was out. No negotiations. No second chances. The incident never hit the tabloids, but insiders knew what had happened. "He thinks unpredictability is genius," one crew member said later. "I think it's exhausting." For Goldie, it was more than exhausting. It was the last time she agreed to play the steady hand alongside a chaos agent. From that moment on, she began saying no to roles that paired her with volatile male co-stars. Not in the quiet, polite Hollywood way, but decisively. She wasn't walking away from comedy. She was walking toward peace. But while Murray's insults came in the middle of a film set, the next one came under the bright lights of a charity gala, and cut even deeper. It was supposed to be one of Goldie Hawn's proudest nights. A charity gala in Malibu, dedicated to raising awareness for mental health, a cause she had championed for decades. The guest list was stacked with advocates, celebrities, and philanthropists. Goldie had been invited to speak, not as an actress, but as someone deeply committed to making a difference. Her table sat near the stage. Just a few tables over sat Sean Penn, slouched in his chair like he'd been dragged there against his will. From the moment Goldie walked toward the podium, he made it clear he wasn't impressed. First came the sighs, loud, drawn out, just shy of theatrical. Then the eye rolls, obvious enough that nearby guests couldn't help but notice. One attendee swore they heard him mutter, "Another celebrity wellness sermon," just loud enough for it to sting. Goldie spoke anyway. Her voice was steady, her words carefully chosen. A heartfelt plea for kindness and understanding in a world that often demanded masks instead of honesty. She didn't ask for applause, she asked for empathy. When she finished, polite clapping filled the room until one voice cut through, clear and unmistakable. She should stick to giggling. It was Pennsylvania. He leaned back in his chair, smirking like he'd just delivered a clever punchline. Some guests laughed awkwardly. Most just stared at the floor. Goldie paused for the briefest moment, then did something entirely her. She smiled, raised her champagne glass, and walked back to her table. Not long after, she left the event. In the car, she let the mask drop. "My whole career," she told a friend later that night, "and I'm still reduced to giggles by men who don't know what I stand for." It wasn't embarrassment that hurt. It was exhaustion, the kind that settles deep after years of having to prove yourself in rooms that were never built for you. From that night forward, she quietly cut Penn out of her professional world. No interviews, if he was involved, no joint panels, no staged photos. When a magazine later asked her opinion of him, her answer was just 3 words: "Not my energy." But if Penn's jab was meant to belittle her in public, the next man on her list tried to dismantle her in private, in the middle of a room full of decision-makers. The role was supposed to be a turning point, a high-profile prestige drama, the kind of project that could showcase Goldie Hawn in a new light. She'd built a career on charm, wit, and impeccable comedic timing, but she was ready to show the world her depth. Dustin Hoffman was already attached to star. On paper, it was the perfect pairing. The audition was held in a stark, clinical casting room. Goldie walked in focused, prepared, determined to prove she belonged in this space as much as anyone. The scene began, and she poured herself into it. Then Hoffman stopped everything. "You're not connecting," he said flatly in front of the producers, as if she wasn't even in the room. Before she could respond, he twisted the knife. "She's still playing it like a sitcom." The room went still. Some producers chuckled nervously. Others stared at the table. Goldie understood instantly. This wasn't direction. It was humiliation, delivered publicly, designed to knock her off balance. She didn't flinch. She finished the scene, her voice steady, her hands still. But inside, she felt the weight of every time a man had tried to define her by what she wasn't instead of what she was. The next morning, she called her agent and withdrew from the project. No negotiations, no second chances. "I won't fight to be taken seriously by men who already decided I'm a punchline," she said. Hoffman moved on. The role went to someone else. But everyone in that casting room remembered the moment. It wasn't method acting. It wasn't creative rigor. It was ego in action. And Goldie wasn't going to let it shape her career. From then on, she stopped chasing roles that required her to prove her legitimacy to people who had already dismissed her. She defined her worth on her own terms and never looked back. In Hollywood, grudges rarely stay private. They leak, they explode, they turn into headlines. But Goldie Hawn has never needed public feuds to make her point. She didn't shout. She didn't run to the press. She simply drew her lines and never let the wrong people cross them again. Kirk Douglas, Warren Beatty, Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, Sean Penn, Dustin Hoffman. 6 very different men, 6 very different encounters. But together, they tell the same story. A story about how charm can turn into control, how talent can be overshadowed by ego, and how resilience sometimes looks like walking away without a sound. For decades, she's been called Hollywood's Golden Girl. But the truth is, Goldie Hawn is something far rarer. A woman who learned how to survive in an industry built to shrink her, and then chose to thrive on her own terms. She didn't win by tearing anyone down. She won by refusing to play the game. And maybe that's why she's still here, smiling, decades after some of the men who tried to diminish her have faded into rumor and footnotes. Because in the end, the real revenge isn't a headline. It's outlasting the people who thought they could write your story for you. So, what do you think? Were these just difficult personalities? Or proof that even the brightest stars have to fight to keep their light?